if you carefully look at Genesis 19, there are passages here that might be concerning or confusing or downright frustrating. And some might ask, well, why is it in the text? I want to remind all of us that the Old Testament is a foreign country. Why does this matter? We read the scriptures because we want to experience the gospel. Now, what's interesting, and I want to be clear here, the gospel is in the scriptures, and the scriptures sometimes have stories that may not be completely relevant to every aspect of the gospel. I've actually said to some people, the gospel is in the scriptures, but the scriptures aren't the gospel. Now, we do accept the scriptures as God's word, but yet they were written a long time ago. We're talking specifically the Old Testament, by people from a different culture at a different time with different life perspectives. And sometimes what we see is that we enter into the Bible, it feels like we're in a foreign country. So let's spend some time thinking about why would these stories be preserved, and why would the Bible writers want these stories to be in there for their original audience? Now, this is another important point, that the original audience may have had a different reason for hearing and listening to these stories. Today's audience might be having different concerns. And so we might find ourselves a little bit confused or put off by some of the stories, only because the stories were originally intended for a different audience that may have had different cares and concerns than us. So what we want to do is try to unpack this a bit and see where can we find meaningful benefit from some of these stories that feel a little challenging at times. For example, the story about Sodom being destroyed. Now we know that Lot, the nephew of Abraham, had lived in Sodom, and 3 angelic visitors went down to Sodom to tell Lot and his family to leave. Lot meets these men at the gate of the city, which is interesting. Today's cities usually don't have walls around them. And often they might have a central park where people might gather and hang out and have social exchange. In the ancient world, in the time of Abraham, many cities had walls as a way to protect themselves. And the city gate was where a lot of public transactions would happen, where visitors to the city would be interrogated to see if they were allowed to be in. This would be a place where you might engage in contracts or do judgments. So it's interesting that Lot seems to be in some position of power or authority that he actually is at the city gate. And so he brings these men in, brings them into his own home, which is a strong sign of hospitality, and yet it seems like the whole community is in this uproar of wondering who these men are, and the community wants to mistreat them. Now you have this strange comment where Lot says, "Don't mistreat my guests," which would be a major violation, "but here are my 2 daughters." Now, some people looked at that and said, well, why would it be that Lot would be willing to have his own daughters molested by the crowd? Some Bible interpreters think maybe this could be understood as something like, let's say you're talking to the bank and they are coming after you to get money, and you might say, well, go ahead and take my children's clothes and food too. You might say that a bit sarcastically, not because you're actually telling the bank to take the food and clothing from your children, but you're trying to express maybe the outrage you feel that the bank is being heavy-handed with you. And perhaps that's what's going on with Lot, that he's trying to make a case to the men of the city, like, hey, you guys are being a little ridiculous here, to the point that I'm feeling like even my entire family is under threat, that I'd have to say that it's almost like you guys want to ruin my own daughters. So that's an interesting thing that may be going on in what we call this foreign country of the Old Testament, that Lot is actually trying to protect his whole family from a community that apparently had no love and no mercy and no willingness to accommodate foreigners in their midst. It's almost like they didn't want these unknown people in their midst, that these people were going to cause problems, and so the whole community is like, we're kicking out these foreigners, or we're going to abuse them and hurt them. So, as we know, these 3 divine guests tell Lot and his family to get out of town. And they give them some instructions, right? Leave town, don't look back. And we get this interesting part of the story where apparently Lot's wife, she looks back, or the metaphor here is actually she literally turned and actually put herself back into Sodom. She returned to Sodom. The text says she looked back, but likely what she did is return to Sodom. The lesson for all of us is that if divine messengers give us a message, we should be disciplined to follow to the letter of the law and to not turn our eyes back to the world and return back to the ways of the world when God's divine messengers have worked hard to take us out. Now, let me just share one other insight here about a tough part of Genesis 19. We have in the story that after Sodom is destroyed, that Lot and his daughters hide away in a cave, and the daughters get Lot drunk and then get impregnated by him. Now, for most of us, we'd say, you know, I try to avoid movies like this. Why do I get this in the scriptures? We have to ask ourselves a couple of things. First, what might the original audience be interested in preserving stories in the Bible? And if you look at the names of the two sons born from these relationships, for the ancient Israelites, these were the two ancient enemies of the Israelites. These nations lived east of the Jordan and often were fighting with the Israelites. So perhaps what we have is a nationalistic story that the Israelites loved to hear and preserve for themselves about the origin story of their own enemies, coming from incestuous relationships between Lot and his daughters. Now, we might look at this and say, boy, it would have been better had some pure doctrine been preserved in the text. I totally agree. But again, sometimes we enter into a foreign country of the Old Testament, and sometimes we have to try to understand what did the original audience get out of this text, even if today we may not find, perhaps in the Lot and his daughter stories, a lot of personal insight. There are reasons why these things show up in the text. Let's bring this to conclusion. If we actually focus on the core of this particular chapter, the idea is that God will send his messengers. And if we follow his messengers' instructions, we can be saved from the destructions that will happen to those who are not willing to listen to God's word.